Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Miriam. Happy to be here.
Yes. Cannot wait to geek out on facilitation with you.
Yeah.
So much to learn. And I kick it off always with the same question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
Yeah, I do. And I probably started around 23, 24 years ago. I had come out of the consulting business and I was leading the strategy practice of a large consulting firm and had been exposed to, all strategy consultants are facilitators to some extent. I mean, a lot of what they do is sense making with large group or small groups tends to be. And, but then I stumbled across a particular approach to facilitation. I thought, wow, that's what I want to do. It took me a couple of days to figure out. It was really an epiphany. I said, this is what I want to do, career change. And that started around, that epiphany was in 1996. But then it took me several years to extract myself from the consulting business and then to have the courage. And the courage was helped by the fact that I got sacked by my employer. And that, of course, takes the place of courage. It was very convenient. So it took me several years to actually think of myself as a facilitator and make that my core activity till about, say, 2003, 2004. So 21 years, let's say.
Wow. And what led to the epiphany and what was the mindset shift that had to happen from consulting to facilitation?
So there's a short answer and a long answer.
We have time.
I'll start with the short one. No, because the long one touches on something that we had talked about in the interview before this call, which is about what is a facilitator and what does the word even mean to me. And I had a discovery back in 1996 that affected that, which I'll touch on. But I guess it was realizing that I'm not a very good consultant and I was potentially a much better facilitator. That a consultant, this again is I have some ideas about what's the distinction between a consultant and a facilitator. And one of them is that a consultant consults, is giving counsel, and therefore is guiding, is saying, here's a direction to go, do this. And on the one hand, let's say upstream brings data collection, analysis, a lot of observation, things like that, which facilitators do too. Downstream turn that into directions, often in the form of bullet points on slides. And I wasn't particularly good at it. And but the part of consulting that involved facilitation, I was good at. It just didn't occur to me that that was a job. And then I stumbled across the fact that, yeah, you could actually make a living doing this. And then slowly eased myself away from consulting until it happened all at once when I got sacked. So that simplified things for me. That was
Wonderful.
a good move on their part, yeah.
Yeah, and I was a little bit surprised when you said that consultants are facilitators. I think the good ones are. And that's why I'm also curious about the mindset shift. Because as you say, as a consultant, you guide in a direction and you're responsible of the outcome. That's a big responsibility, and it requires you to be there as a different sort of guide than the facilitator who trusts that the group will come up with a result that they own eventually.
Yeah, I think that consultants are made nervous by the idea of emergence. They want to know the answer beforehand, and we have to jump in. We might have a hypothesis about what the outcome will be, but if it's anything more than a hypothesis, it's a problem.
Yeah, that's a difference to research. And I realized, I mean, I'm training a group of consultants in facilitation. And what I found intriguing is how the use of questions is different in facilitation versus consulting. When consulting, very often they're questions where there is a specific answer. So is it true or is it not true, like in a hypothesis? But then in facilitation, I tend more towards questions where there is no answer, but it's all about the different perspectives and making sense of what comes up.
They say about lawyers in court that a lawyer in court will never ask a question unless he or she already knows the answer.
Mm.
And I think of that as what consultants do. I also think of it to some extent as what, maybe not the best teachers, but as what many teachers do. They ask questions knowing what the answer is. I think a facilitator asks questions precisely because we don't know. And our questioning is driven by curiosity. And a consultant's questions, like a lawyer's questions, are intentionally leading. And that's not a problem if you're a consultant. That's your job, because you do have a hypothesis. At least a good consultant also starts with a hypothesis, but then does the data collection, the analytics, the testing, the prototyping in order to test that hypothesis.
Mm. And I wonder, the hypothesis, is there a danger of being biased and looking for a specific answer and then maybe forgetting that there might be different answers or that the hypothesis might be wrong?
Yeah, that's a big danger. Well, first, that the hypothesis might be wrong is our job to try to disprove it in a sense.
Yeah.
But walking into a workshop, walking into an environment that you're facilitating, thinking that you know the answer is the kiss of death. That's really a problem. And we all face it. And as we work with the same client over and over again, and we learn more and more about their business, we start to form opinions. And those opinions are not helpful.
Mm.
And even when I bite my tongue and try to keep them to myself, I can't hide where my preferences lay. And I do risk steering, which is not facilitating.
Yeah. Although there's a big debate on the neutrality of facilitators, right? There's some facilitators who say, okay, we have to be neutral, and the least we know about the business and the client, the better, because then we can keep this healthy naivete almost, or ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
And others believe if they see the group running in the wrong direction, then it's their responsibility to also share their knowledge and subject matter expertise. And then it's less neutral.
So let's unpack that for a minute, because one thing is about running in the wrong direction and the other is about sharing expertise. And I don't think that one follows from the other.
Mm-hmm.
First, it means trying to define what it means to run in the wrong direction. And if that means running away from a likely or preferred outcome, I don't think that's our job.
Mm-hmm.
But running away from what we judge as an unconstructive discussion
Mm-hmm.
is our job to redirect.
Yeah.
And now we'll be wrong half the time if we think that's unconstructive. Maybe it turns out that it was super constructive, and we'll be wrong. So again, it's a hypothesis. We're going to try something out. And at that moment, when maybe the energy is shifting in what we take to be an unconstructive direction, our job is, through questions, to open a door and create the opportunity for the group to walk through that door without pushing them through. We're not sheepdogs pushing the sheep through a gate. We're opening a door as an opportunity for them to reshape their discussion, but it's not a direction to them to reshape their discussion.
So it's neutrality towards the content.
With neutrality towards the content.
Yeah, the solution.
And again, when you work with clients over and over again, you learn a lot about the content, and you start sometimes to mistake yourself for an expert, and that's really bad news. You know, we're working with a large manufacturer. They have 18,000 engineers, and we work, not anymore. This was a few years ago. We were working with those engineers. They have 18,000 engineers. They don't need 18,001. We're there precisely because we're not engineers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true in general. We're there because we're outsiders. And I know that many of our clients, when they sometimes ask us to help them adopt our methods to use internally, and we help them, it is a challenge for them, because if you're internal, your neutrality is by definition compromised.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things you can't do. You figure out to do other things instead. But there's a lot you can't do if you're inside.
Absolutely, because you don't see the blind spots.
Mm-hmm.
And you do have an opinion or an agenda in one form or another. The unconscious bias.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering about the mindset shift from consulting to facilitation, because consultants, and I don't know how it was in your firm, are very often, they're trained to know an answer and to come up with an answer and to know, and then to step into the space of not knowing deliberately. There's a lot of ego and learned, trained behavior that you have to keep at the door.
Yeah. I mean, this is something I do think about a lot, not just because I used to be a consultant, but it touches on an area of interest to me and to my colleagues about what a complex system is. And when we talk about complexity, what do we mean by that? And I think that, I mean, there's tons of definitions. One that I like very much comes from a guy called Dave Snowden, who has a company called Kinefin, which is a Welsh word. And he has a model about different types of systems: simple systems, complicated systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. I assume you've come across him at some point or other. I mean, he's very remarkable. Anyway, a simple system is one that you know the answer, you just do it. So the light bulb is blown, you get a new light bulb, you replace it. A complicated one requires some level of expertise, and you might refer to best practice. And then that's why you might call a consultant. Because a consultant has that experience from elsewhere, and that the experience acquired in a different context might very likely be applicable in this context. And so it's about applying things learned elsewhere. And that's what consultants are trained to do, and they're really good at it. And probably 80% of problems in the world fall into that category. And that's why there's so much work for consultants. The issue arises in the next type of system, a complex system. And in a complex system, cause and effect can only be discerned in hindsight. You can't predict cause and effect, meaning a solution that worked someplace else has no better than an even chance of working here. So it's in the realm of complex systems that emergence starts to make sense. And that's what we as facilitators do. That's our job, is to create that room for emergence. And where we add value is in those complex systems where a consultant might be handicapped by reliance on best practice and on previous or even good practice, which again, in some circumstances is helpful. In a complex system is probably not helpful. It can be misleading.
And this makes me wonder whether any system where human beings are involved very quickly turns into a complex system.
Well, yeah, we complicate things, don't we? I mean, wouldn't things be simple if everything was just linear cause and effect?
Yeah.
Without iteration, without looping, without feedback. In fact, you could say that those circumstances I just listed mean something isn't a system, because systems are made of feedback, are made of looping. And so humans add that system element, which means unpredictability, which means something other than linear cause and effect. So yeah, we complicate things, we humans.
Yeah, and that's why we need the process. And that's where the process facilitation comes in.
Yeah, but I shouldn't have said we complicate things, we complexify things, because things can be complicated without us. I mean, look at the carbon cycle or at the water cycle, that there's no humans involved, but it's predictable. So there, it is complicated, but it's predictable. Whereas you add humans and you take something like a carbon cycle or a water cycle, and all of a sudden you have global warming because humans added this element of unpredictability. And all of a sudden you're looking at complexity, and you can't consult your way out of that.
Yeah. And do you think that clients, when they seek help, they some sort of advice, that they get mixed up with what is complicated and what is complex, and that might feel drawn to consultants because they think it is a complicated problem, not seeing the complexity, and then ending up with a simplified solution?
Yeah, I mean, that's I don't think that's a risk, that's a certainty. People are much more comfortable with complicated problems because you can entrust them to someone. I mentioned my wife broke her leg 3 weeks ago, and she found the best orthopedic surgeon. She has trust that he knows how to open a leg and bolt it back together and close it up again. And she's right, he did, and he did a great job. And that is a linear, complicated, but not complex system. Now, most clients hope that their problems are like that they are susceptible to experts rather than to discovery and emergence. Discovery and emergence makes people nervous because they walk into a process not knowing what the outcome is going to be.
Yeah. And how do you deal with these clients? Because I think, especially in risk-averse industries, and you spoke about climate and engineers, and I think in the mindset of these people, there's always a high risk involved, and as an engineer, you want to minimize the risk. And the way how we as humans usually minimize the risk is we try to control it. We try to minimize uncertainty. So how do you open then the space for emergence and guide the group to opening for that?
So I think that maybe some of my favorite clients are in fact engineers. If I reflect on who I'm working with now and who I've been working with over the years, that a lot of them are engineers and we get along great. And I think it's because they do get what we do, I think, without thinking that they know how to do it. And that they're willing to open up and let us in, tinker a little bit, because it is so foreign to an engineer's way of thinking. And I've had very good luck with that. Now, you use the word control, and I think that that's the difficult word. I mean, it sounds a bit sort of Zen, and I don't mean it that way, but I do think that control in the best of circumstances is an illusion. And I think when we are working with a client who is very command and control driven, they're made nervous by our way of working and they end up not being clients.
Yeah, especially in a group collaboration context, you cannot control. Well, you can control the process to some extent. And I can see how engineers can relate to that because it is an engineered process at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I think that they appreciate that there's, I mean, what we do is itself complex. I mean, in our particular approach, my colleagues' approach to facilitation, we use a method that's not ours, that comes from M.G. Taylor. It's called the design shop approach. I think you've heard about it from other guests. It is very rich. It's got a lot of moving parts. And as solutions do emerge, the purpose of those moving parts starts to become evident and can be exciting for an engineer. Oh, that's why we did that. You know, one of our design principles is everything speaks. And so we pay enormous attention to detail because every detail is a microcosm of the system we're trying to address. And that only makes sense in hindsight because it's a complex system. So up front, all the circus that we bring, all the complexity, all the moving parts look like complication. They probably look like cost drivers as well. But in hindsight, and immediately after a large workshop, that's why we were doing this. That's why you had that piece. And everything starts to fall into place in hindsight, which is the hallmark of a complex system, that it does make sense in hindsight, though beforehand it could not be predicted.
And you said everything speaks. What do you mean by that?
So, I mean, just as an example, we put colored markers on our whiteboards, and we tend to have 7 colors. And we tend to put 3 cold colors on the left, 3 warm colors on the right, and then a black one in the middle. I mean, that's insane. It's sort of a level of detail that why would you bother? Well, I mean, there's practical reasons. It means that at a distance, you can see what's missing without having to walk over there and then get the right marker and add it, right? So that it's got a very practical purpose, but it tells a story as well of things being in their place, of what about context, about the cold colors acquire meaning as cold colors opposite the warm colors. If they were just cold colors, you might not have thought, oh yeah, that's what they share. So it's a tiny example,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it demonstrates that those tiny details are themselves microcosms of the systems that we are being asked to facilitate. And so by
Mm-hmm.
paying attention to those tiny details, not to the extent that you go crazy, but to the extent that it fits within your rhythm of work and your capabilities, it's exemplifying a level of care and a system awareness that ignoring those details might camouflage.
Mm. And yeah, the details, it's interesting because they're the small details that make all the difference, especially when they're invisible to the group.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are also some details that, yeah, some are practical, as you described, and others are almost like nudges or a way to get a group in a specific mindset without them even noticing it.
They don't need to notice.
Yeah.
It's we notice and it changes our behavior. And then we exemplify those behaviors of care, of attention to detail, but attention to the detail, not for its own sake, but because it's a microcosm of the broader system. And we exemplify those behaviors, which participants, some of them, not all, but some will pick up on, and it might affect their behavior in a marginal way, but in a positive way.
Yeah. You suggested the title for the show, Playing Other People's Games by Our Rules. And I'm intrigued and would love to know what comes to your mind when you say that.
Well, you asked at the beginning about my epiphany and realizing that there is something to facilitation. It is different from consulting and that it might fit me very well. And I said, there's a short version and a long version. You probably thought my explanation was the long version, but that's actually the short one. Here's the long one.
Yes.
So my very first exposure to these methods was in the autumn of 1996 in Palo Alto. And it was a 5-day workshop. It was training of people in these methods. And although I didn't even really understand that that's what it was. And there were maybe 60 participants. The facilitators were Matt Taylor, Gail Taylor, and Brian Kaufman. And Matt and Gail and Brian put together these methods over a few decades. In any event, I wasn't really enjoying it very much. I was jet lagged and, it was a lot of sort of California speak and not really for me. I played along to some extent, but by day 3, I was getting a bit rude because I was just getting fed up. I mean, the individual exercises, some of them were quite interesting about architecture, about games. Read an interesting book on finite and infinite games, and then
I love
applied
that
them.
one.
Lovely book.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were individual elements I liked, but it didn't add up to anything. And then day 4, or maybe towards the end of day 3, we got an assignment. It said, make a team, create a game, and use our pattern language to make the rules of that game. Now, the pattern language are a key set of the elements of what the M.G. Taylor design shop method is about. It. You could call it elements of their method. So let's not call it pattern language. Let's say elements of our method. So the assignment was create a team, build a game, use our methods to create the rules of your game. You have 24 hours for this assignment. So it didn't say who the team should be. I mean, on what basis? Because these are strangers. How do? And then, I guess rules. We learned a bit about rules in the previous days from that book, from learning about architecture. So it was about putting this thing together. We have 24 hours. I think they needed to clear us out of the space as well because they had some other event going on. But you have 24 hours for this, and that was about the hardest assignment ever. And I created a team, and we. I won't mention because it was confidential for the other members of the team. But we did create a game, and the game wasn't really about, actually, it was a business strategy. But thinking about it as a game, it was a business strategy. It was about investments, about inputs, about returns, about partnerships, skills, people, process, technology, knowledge. It was something that a consultant like me, as I was then, could sink their teeth into. But we created it as a team. We put together some rules, which were about basically simulating a business model. And then after 24 hours, we get the next assignment. I think this was written by Brian Kaufman, and I consider it the best assignment of all time, of all workshops. And it said, find another team and play their game using your rules. And I think that was the best assignment in the history of facilitation. And that was my epiphany. I read that assignment before doing it. And of course, I was unable to do it properly. It didn't really work very well. But just asking that question opened a whole universe to me. And that was an epiphany. It blew my mind. And it was, that's what facilitation is. It's playing other people's games by your rules. And I am very conscious of that now when I walk into a workshop, when I walk into a new client, is I think, what's their game? And their game might be their business model. It might be their management culture. It might be their particular ambition. What's their game? And why are their rules inhibiting them from winning? And how do my rules, and I don't dream up my rules every time. My rules are very clear and documented. They are the MG Taylor Design Shop approach. It's all on the internet. Go to www.mgtaylor.com, Taylor with a Y. That's the basis for helping people to escape from their rules and play by our rules. And I have so many tangible examples of that. I mean, every workshop is an example of that. But I'm thinking one of the very first ones, this was the following year. We were in the UK and we had a workshop for Peugeot, the French car company. And it was the first time we did an event that was not in English. And the whole leadership came over, including Christian Peugeot, the patron. And they, the culture in Peugeot is that they, vous voyez, they use the formal vous form when addressing anybody, much less the patron.
Yeah.
And we never thought about that because we'd always worked in English. And how are we going to deal with that? We didn't have to deal with it at all. They walked into the space. They immediately gave each other tutoyer. They gave the informal form of address. We didn't tell them to. They just saw the environment that was so conducive to this kind of work, full of books and toys and acres of whiteboards. And they immediately switched to two without us telling them to, because it didn't occur to us. And then after 3 days, we bring out the champagne. They're clinking glasses and celebrating their success, and they immediately return to vous without us telling them to.
Fascinating.
And so what did we observe? It's basically that language is only one of the rules of the game, but it's a pretty important one. And they played by our rules without us telling them to, that the environment, that our behaviors determined a set of rules that they adapted to. Now, they have to bring their solution back to their own culture, which is a vous voyez culture. It's a formal culture. And so we didn't change them. Our job was not to change their culture in 3 days. You can't change culture in 3 days. But we did take them out of their culture for 3 days because their culture was inhibiting them from solving this particular problem. So that'd be one tiny example. But I think that every time I'm in the front of the room, or more frequently, every time I'm in the back of the room and designing, I'm thinking, how could our rules help them play their game in a different way? Another example, we did a workshop many years ago for the University of Bologna, which is the oldest university in the world. And it was with the rector and the pro-rectors and the academic senate and the management committee and the administrative director, some students, or about 55 people for 3 days. And none of the questions they brought us were new. They had to do with things like the relationship between departments and faculties, with funding of research. These were not new questions. These questions were literally centuries old. They weren't years old or decades old. They were centuries old, and some of them more than 500 years old. Now, I don't want to say we solved 500-year problems in 3 days, but we gave them a new language for 3 days to address old problems. And the problems that clients bring us are rarely new. They've been there forever. But what we give them is space and language and tools and models and rules of the game to have a new conversation about old stuff. And that's our gift. Is it's not that it's new stuff, it's new conversations about old stuff. So when I say what a facilitator does is play other people's games by our rules, those are the sort of things I'm referring to.
I love it, and thank you for the anecdotes. And what I hear is that almost this implies that every workshop is a sort of a game, because a game is a finite thing where new rules apply or a certain set of rules apply.
Well, though you mentioned you'd also read the book Finite and Infinite Games.
Yes.
I think that we're presented with a finite game, and part of our design challenge is to turn it into an infinite game.
Yes.
And there's some very specific cases of that. I mean, I guess the most explicit is we often do simulations, which are very complex to put together, a lot of work, which means we put different participants in a role play. Some of them are customers, some of them are suppliers, blah, blah, blah. And you get people to figure out what are the interests and the expectations of these different roles, and then you put them into a simulation where they interact, and you map these interactions and how could it be optimized and where is there waste and blah, blah. It's a lot of work to put together. But I find when I do put them together, it can take me days and days to draft these things, that my goal is to help them discover an infinite game, which in this case I would call a positive sum game. You know the distinction between a zero-sum game and a positive sum game.
Yes.
A zero-sum game has winners and losers. You can only win if someone else loses. A positive sum game is everyone can win. There potentially is space for everyone to win.
And that's according to the book, the definition of a finite and infinite game. A finite game, there's a goal and the game is over when someone wins, and an infinite game continues forever and new players join or leave. And the goal of the game is to keep on playing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the positive sum and zero sum, I think, come from game theory and John Nash in the 1950s. If you saw the movie A Beautiful Mind, that guy, the Russell Crowe character. Anyway, but it maps perfectly to finite and infinite games. In any event, when we're doing these simulations, when I'm drafting them, I find that the client's goal usually, and I'm pleased about this, is usually to create an infinite game. And it's usually to create a positive sum game. It's not about winners and losers. But to make it a simulation, meaning you need energy, it also has to be fun. You need winners and losers. And you have to, and the key to designing a simulation is to decide what it means to win. What is winning? How do you keep score? What are the different strategies that might or might not provide success in winning? And that's what makes it fun. And so a lot of our work is taking a desire for an infinite game, make it a finite game because it's fun, and then in the debrief, rebuild it as an infinite game again. And discover together where is the space for a positive sum outcome.
And I wonder whether what you described earlier as organizations cannot solve their complex problems because they're inhibited by their rules, whether one of the biggest constraints is actually this finite thinking about the game of winners and losers, bonus structures, a lack of collaboration. So there's an entire mindset shift that needs to happen there, or a big epiphany to see, okay, we all win. There is something like a Nash equilibrium where we can all win.
Yeah. I don't know that it's always a problem. In other words, yes, the culture or the rules they play by might inhibit solving a particular problem. It doesn't mean they cause all problems, which is to say those rules emerged for a reason. And as they say, most systems are optimized to produce exactly what they produce. And
until they don't.
Until they don't. And we may be there at that moment of transformation. But often we're not. We're there in the middle of things. And those rules and that culture and those ways of working have emerged because they sufficiently support the day-to-day, business as usual. Yet the question we've been invited to address is not the day-to-day. So we're not there necessarily to change their culture or to change the rules. We're there to extract them from their culture and from their rules in order to discover a solution. And then, like going from vous voyez to tu voyez, they need to bring it back home. And in 3 days, you don't change their culture. But maybe you can escape from the culture for a few days, take a vacation from the culture in order to discover solutions that your culture or your way of working or your language might otherwise obscure.
Yeah, you can plant a seed.
Yeah.
And then I wonder how to transition then back to their rules. Because as you said, and I think that's true for maybe all workshops, because something happens, if people come together, they're creative, they're collaborative. So it does change something anyway. But then on Monday morning, they have to go back to play by the general rules. So how do you ensure then that the results are robust enough that they can actually live there?
Yeah. I think that's the challenge for all facilitators, and I do think it's our Achilles heel in general. And we have approaches to try to address that. And one is that we've only recently started, many of our colleagues started decades ago, but we've only started building like a little encampment at the client site. We've got two going now, one with the culture ministry here in Italy and one with the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is also in Rome. Where we've taken them out of their culture and we've addressed issues, but then we've built now a little beachhead inside their four walls, where currently we are staffing it, and it's where our workshops tend to be very disruptive, sort of very high barrier to entry. They cost a lot of money. They take a lot of time. They're disruptive. This is the opposite. It's low barrier to entry. You just walk in, you walk out 4 hours later with something unstuck.
Mm-hmm.
And that helps to bridge this transition from our rule world of the workshop to their rule world of the day by day. I think it's potentially successful. We have not yet figured out the business model to support it. We lose money on it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where consultants do much better, and we have a lot to learn from consultants, is that they hold hands for a long time. And again, they fail as much as they succeed, as do we. But they've got a business model and a culture that supports a long-term accompaniment
Mm-hmm.
to the implementation of whatever was dreamed up in the workshop. And we sometimes partner with consultants for that reason.
It makes sense that it fits into their business model because they're solving complicated problems and not complex ones, right? So,
yeah.
And then you can really track the progress, whereas in the complex world is, as you described your workshop, so a lot happens, it doesn't make sense, and suddenly it all comes together. But when it all comes together is pretty much in the unknown, especially when it's a larger project where an organization is going through a transition.
Yeah, it is a challenge. I mean, I know facilitators who do it better than me. I don't know anybody who's really solved it. It's this whole, I call that category value capture. We create an enormous amount of value, just orders of magnitude greater than our client imagined. Yet it needs then to be, it's there, but it needs to be captured. We created this butterfly, but we need the net.
Someone needs to do the work, and it's not the facilitator.
Exactly.
And I think that's maybe the frustrating part, that we can provide the best work and help them to come to the solution. If then nobody does the work and actually implements it, it's out of our hands. And then to have this, when you describe this little entity inside their four walls, I had the image of a first aid station.
Yeah, it is that's exactly right. We called it an acceleration zone, but it is very much a first aid station. And we tell them, this is not about dreaming up new things. This is about, you've got a project, it's stuck. We're going to help you get it unstuck. That's it. But I think that the broader challenge you've raised is one that we all face, and it is our Achilles heel. Because if we consistently we don't come up with the solutions, but we facilitate the emergence of really great solutions, unexpected and powerful, and yet they don't land, there is no value capture, it discredits us. And we're not going to get much repeat business.
Yes. And I wonder to what extent we can support that process, or it's just maybe in the nature of things that,
I
changes.
hope not. I mean, I fear that from time to time, but I do think, and I know I have colleagues who do that better than me. And they may have been, I mean, many of my colleagues were like me, were consultants before becoming facilitators. And maybe they were better consultants than I was. I wasn't a particularly good consultant. And so maybe that's where I fall down in that value capture phase. And I don't think there's a lot of, I mean, there's no um, recipe for ensuring that what was created during a workshop lives on.
Mm.
Yet there are many people who I think have better instincts or better experience than I do. But that I certainly recognize that as my Achilles heel.
And I think all of us, and that's maybe the benefit again of the consultant, that they are they approach the thing by the numbers. So they would be the ones to say, okay, if you're designing the solution, this is the budget we need. These are
Yeah.
the full-time equivalents we need. This is how you need to structure it so that it actually can persist. And I think this part, many clients are not aware that actually after the workshop, they do need a budget. They do need the
Yeah.
people to actually implement it. It's not, it won't happen just out of nowhere.
And we often, not often enough, but very often we involve consultants in our work for that purpose,
Yeah.
where we throw them in as participants. They're very happy because working shoulder to shoulder with their clients, that way they get a lot more work. But for us, it increases the likelihood that our impact will have a long tail.
Yeah. Yeah. Very smart. And I love the accelerator booth, the first aid. And I somehow the progress principle came to my mind by Amabile, Teresa Amabile, I think,
Don't know
where
it.
she says the one thing, she's a researcher, maybe from Harvard. It's an old book, where the one thing that distinguishes those at work who are happy and fulfilled and thrive, and those who are not, is a sense of meaningful progress. And I think very often the transition from during the workshop to after the workshop is so big. And we often fail to cut it down into the smallest pieces so that everyone can have a sense of meaningful progress
Yeah,
as soon
that's
as
a good
they
way to think
step
about it
out.
at the individual level. Because we think about it institutionally. You know, another of our design principles is that we always work backwards from desired outcomes. When I'm designing a
Very
workshop,
engineering.
I never go, here's the first module, then there's the next one, then there's the next one. I always say, what's the last one? And then I walk backwards because the last one better map to their desired outcomes. And and using that approach, we tend to start the design process not with the desired outcomes of the workshop, but the desired outcomes of the client. So there might be weeks, months, or sometimes years after our workshop. What does goodness look like? And then we walk backwards from there to the end of our workshop. So that means that by the end of the workshop, you'll have A, B, and C, right? Yeah, yeah. And that will then enable us over the subsequent 6 months to launch the strategy, to complete this acquisition, to whatever their objective is. And everything we do in the workshop is simply an enabler to a broader and a longer term objective of theirs. So for us, that walking backwards is key to what we do.
Yeah, yeah, backward engineering. And then you're also clear that then you can track whether you are on track or not, given the final result you're actually aiming
That's
to.
another one. How do you measure? How do you know if you're on track or not? And our clients often ask us, how do you measure your impact? And we don't have a good answer. I mean, we have a rather flip answer. We say, well, if they call us back, then that is a good sign. And in fact, they do call us back. And so we have plenty of good signs and we don't feel the need to measure more carefully. But actually, we ought to measure more carefully. Maybe not about, we don't do client satisfaction surveys. We don't like that because, well, we do client satisfaction, but not participant satisfaction. Now that we have a quality certification, we're required to, but I don't really like it because it implies that people need to be happy to achieve what they're after. And I don't care if they're happy. It's did they achieve what they wanted? And in any event, we don't have good methods for assessing our impact over time. We do have some discussion. In fact, my colleagues and I, twice a year, we look at each event. We have it coming up on the 5th of August, where we spend a day looking at each project we did over the previous 6 months and saying, you know, how did it go? What could we do better? But we could do that same analysis at the level of the individual objectives rather than of the project. And then we would need input from the client. I mean, it would be a wise thing to do. It would be demanding, but probably wise, because we do get asked, how do you measure your impact? And our answer is not a good one.
Yeah. And this could actually be combined with this headquarters inside their four walls, where they can just come and check in and see how they progress and maybe gamify.
With the acceleration zone, that actually does give us it gives us a little window, at least for the duration of that acceleration zone, you know, for how many months or whatever. And then other clients, not clients of ours, but clients of some of our colleagues, have adopted these acceleration zones and then kept them going, running them internally for years. And that's great.
It's really sustainable.
I wish we could pull that off. It is sustainable in some environments. We've not managed to pull that off yet, but that's our ambition.
Beautiful. You spoke about disruption earlier, that you facilitate this, or that your workshops are disruptive. And I have the impression that disruption is, there are many who call themselves disruptive. So what do you mean by that, and what makes something disruptive?
Yeah. I mean, first, at the most practical level, it's disruptive because it's 3 days, 3 long days out of the office. So you don't have time to do calls, check your email. We often find people if they do. And
how do you do that?
Well, for example, we did some work recently for UNICEF. UNICEF is a very important client of ours. And we did a session recently in Rome. And people came from all over the world. And, you know, it's rare that they have that opportunity, and we don't want them to waste it. And so basically, if you use your phone, 10 euros goes to Save the Children. And if you don't use your phone, if nobody does over these days, I will make a contribution in your name to UNICEF. And, you know, as soon as you say Save the Children, of course, they laugh, because Save the Children is wonderful. And Save the Children is also an implementing partner of UNICEF. I mean, they're the good guys, yet they're also competitors in the fundraising area. So if I say, you know, that your money goes to Save the Children, they make a nervous laugh and they switch off their phones. Anyway, so there's the practical disruption. But I think more importantly, when we do bring new language, and again, I think that's part of our job. A big part of our job is bringing new language and new tools to old problems. That new language is super disruptive. It deprives you of that shorthand that we think makes language or communication efficient, but actually causes misunderstanding. That when you're using new language, you actually need to explain what you mean.
Yes.
And that's disruptive because it upends hierarchies, because it robs you of expectations. That providing new language, I can't think of anything more disruptive than that.
And can you give an example?
Oh my goodness, yeah. I mean, a lot of the, you know, thinking about examples, I land on models that we use, which are part of what we call the pattern language of this method, that a lot of them are built around models. And you can see them on that website that I cited, www.mgtaylor.com. There's about 30, 35 models there, and there's a few that we use all the time, and many that we should use all the time and just use sometimes. And they're, you know how consultants have their models. So like BCG has their model mapping market share to growth, and they have their star, dog, cash cow, et cetera. These are models that help us diagnose and design collaborative moments. And one of them that I like very much is called Vantage Points. And it's basically, it looks like tree rings. You know, you cut a tree and you see the rings that are its age. This is not age, but it's or like a topographic map, only you don't know which is up and which is down. And it's 7 elements, which are philosophy, culture, policy, strategy, tactics, logistics, tasks. Those are pretty easy. I mean, everyone will have their own definitions of those words. But philosophy, yeah, that involves your vision, your mission. Culture, well, culture is the visible manifestation of your values. So there's values in there.
Mm-hmm.
Policy is about limiting variety. Strategy is about trade-offs in a world of scarce resource.
Mm-hmm.
Tactics is, yeah, we know how to do this. That's when you maybe call the consultant. How was it done last time? Logistics, do I have the money? Do I have the people? Do I have the skills? Do I have the partnerships? And then task, who does what by when? So
Mm-hmm.
you've got these seven, I don't want to call them layers, they're just seven lenses. And the idea is that they need coherence amongst them. And that if something's broken at a certain level, so let's say we don't have the resources we need, or that's logistics, right? We don't have the resources we need. We don't have the right skills. We don't have the right equipment. If you go fixing logistics, you'll probably stumble across the same problem over and over again. That this model suggests you move to a higher layer in that
Mm-hmm.
model. If logistics is broken, look at policy, look at strategy. So one example is this big aircraft manufacturing company that had 18,000, still has, I think, 18,000 engineers. And they use the CAD, CAD, computer-aided design. When they design airplanes, they use these very sophisticated CAD programs on their computers, which are, it's just computer-aided design. Anyway, but those who work on the older planes were trained on two-dimensional CAD. Those who work on the newer planes were trained on three-dimensional CAD because the technology improved. So now when they buy new software, those who work on the older planes, they put a 2D emulator on top of the 3D software because that's what they were trained to do.
Yeah.
So what if they didn't do that? Well, if they didn't do that, if actually it takes years to learn the program, so it's very expensive to train people. But it means that then they can move from plane to plane and take their experience with them. And, oh, you made this error on that plane. Let's not do it on this plane, this model. And so think how that's basically changing their language. It's not adopting our language, but it's changing their language. Their language is CAD. It's the tool they use. And by giving them a tool that all the other engineers also use, opens an enormous door for them. It means that they can work on each other's projects. And then think about the opportunity for institutional learning, for innovation, because you've given them a new language.
Mm.
And think how disruptive that is in the most positive sense of the word. I mean, it's transformational.
So by language, you mean almost a lens through which you look at the problem, or a model,
exactly,
a way of thinking.
It could be a lens, it could be a model, which is a way of thinking or of categorizing. It could really be just definitional. So I gave you my definition of strategy, right, which is documenting trade-offs in a world of scarce resource. Your definition might be different. If we could get all 50 of us in the room to agree the same definition of that word, we're going to be much more constructive, and it could be disruptive in a very positive way. Just to agree, everyone throws the word around, but do any three people mean the same thing when they use it?
And I think this is one of the most important things that we underestimate. To what extent, especially when we are with subject matter experts, highly specialized in a space, that we quickly assume that we mean the same things by using the same words.
Yeah, it's dangerous thinking that we understand. My son, who's now 33, he must have been like 5 or 6, and he had a nightmare once. And I never forget this nightmare. What was the nightmare? Words lost their meaning was his nightmare. And of course, that's in a sense everyone's nightmare, but we put it out of our minds. And that's so much of our job is to ensure, and it's the care we take in ensuring that words have meaning. And when we hear words, when we're in the front of the room and we hear words that we don't know the meaning of, we have to ask. Because the fact that, we're ignorant, but we're not stupid. And the fact that we don't know doesn't imply that the others do know. And we have to listen to ourselves. And if we think, what does that mean? Then we have to say that out loud. What does that mean? And we have to give words their meaning. And I think it's one of the tools that we have of greatest value to our clients is that we don't take for granted what the words mean. We ask, We let them ask each other, and we let them land on what it really means.
Yeah. Which then, as such, this discussion can be very disruptive. Because for groups who have talked about the same thing for ages, not realizing that they actually mean something different. I think
Exactly.
the same is true in partnerships.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's when the big problems happen. From your experience, what makes a workshop fail?
Right. Luckily, I don't have that much experience with with failure, but I do have experience with failure, as do we all. And I think that if there's one recurring cause, it's poor sponsor engagement. That having sponsors who make genuine contributions to the design, to challenging it, to um, trying to build coherence and alignment amongst their team about why we're doing this, where we headed. That when that's lacking, a workshop is at enormous risk, and not and I mean risk. I don't even know risk is the word. It is so likely to go wrong if we don't have that engagement up front. And if we don't have it up front, it's not going to be visible during the workshop because I don't own the workshop. I'm just facilitating it. It's you, sponsor, own it. Are you going to demonstrate that ownership? Is it going to be visible? Is it an attribute of your leadership? When that's lacking, I get nervous.
Yeah. And that's again a tricky one. What I observe very often is due to a lack of time and involvement beforehand, then all of this work hasn't been done.
Yeah.
Everyone
we indicate beforehand, this is what we're going to need of you. And our tagline says matter, we make it easy. And it's just not true at all. We don't make it easy. We're super demanding. And we make it clear up front, here's what we're going to need from you. We're going to need this time. We're going to need this whole group of people to be together. Since COVID, of course, a lot of those sponsor meetings have migrated online, and we push back big time. And we want the sponsor meetings to be in person as well.
What's the difference?
Oh my goodness, it's night and day. It's because I'm not a great online facilitator, maybe, but there's so many dimensions you lose. That's a whole other topic. Is just what do we lose online? And just off the top of my head, well, body language, just the physical presence of being in the same space with somebody, and the way that makes you feel that you might have a shared destiny, at least for the next couple of hours or days. The way people interrupt each other in person that they don't online. Those interruptions are important to observe, and because they're often an indicator of power dynamics. It's just you lose so much online. I mean, yeah, we've improved a lot thanks to COVID, but we've improved from being 1,000 times worse to only being 100 times worse.
Interesting. And I'm curious about the interruptions. So yes, they say a lot about culture, and power dynamics could also be enthusiasm or lack of awareness. So how do you deal with that?
All those things. It can also just be culture. I mean, I work in Italy. About half of my work is in Italy, where these are sort of national stereotypes that sadly have a kernel of truth in them. But the fact that Italians are always interrupting each other, why is that? It's because they're desperately unhappy with silence. That 1 second of silence in Italy causes enormous discomfort. So Italians will interrupt each other to forestall that silence, even if it's 1 second long. That causes anxiety. I work in Finland, where they'll put a pause right in the middle of a phrase. And if you interrupt, you're rude. You just have to wait for that silence to pass. And that's his national attributes, I think, cultural attributes. But then, yes, you do have power dynamics. You see the way that men tend to interrupt when women are speaking. You see much less of the opposite. all these things are lenses into what their culture is, what their dynamics are, how they relate to each other, who does get listened to and why. I mean, it's just, you miss a lot. That's just one attribute of being online that you lose. But there's so many others, like body language, just like taking coffee together and the small talk. I mean, just all of it.
Yeah. And would the interruptions or no interruptions or embracing silence, would this be some of the rules you bring in? So do you do some sort of contracting?
I never have. I take it as given. I mean, we have our rules when they're in our space. And we don't list those rules. We exemplify them. We don't run, we walk. We don't say that, but we walk with purpose and intent. And it's a tiny detail, but it reflects the other things we do. So all that you can do in person. When you're on the client site, we make a great effort to make it ours. It's hard because it's their place and therefore their game. It's always their game, but sometimes their language if it's in their joint.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll do things like, we use music, for example. And if I'm at a client site even for a first meeting, I'll bring along an exercise, and then I'll bring along a speaker. And while they're doing the exercise, I'll play music. And for the first 30 seconds, it freaks them out. Who are these people? But they get over it. And meanwhile, I have staked a claim to that space. Now it's my space.
Mm-hmm.
And even though, yes, physically I'm a guest on your premises, in practice, I've given them an assignment. They're doing my assignment. I'm playing music. I have a graphic facilitator listening and drawing. And I've staked a claim to their space now. And at that point, I can start to introduce my rules to have a better understanding of their game.
Mm. And I love, the detail of music and the disruption this brings.
Absolutely. It brings disruption in both directions. So for the first 30 seconds, especially if you're on their site and their premises, they think these people are insane. But once they've used music, even though it's largely subconscious, they miss it when it's missing immediately. And it becomes, I would have a great difficulty facilitating without music. I wouldn't know where to start, really. It's such a fundamental tool, and yet it's always in the background. I mean, there are brief moments when it's in the foreground, but for me, that's one of my fundamental tools, as much as having two hands and a mouth,
mm-hmm.
and a couple of ears sometimes.
Music facilitates. And so it's a facilitative force in a sense that it supports a certain rhythm and certain mindsets, maybe.
So I think, music has many attributes. There's rhythm, where you have this sneaky little slider in their head that you can address without them even noticing. So, they're in teams and they're full of energy and they're all bouncing things off each other. But actually, that's a moment when you want them to be reflective. And so you change the music, you put on something maybe in a minor key, something with a slower tempo. And within 90 seconds, without them aware of it, it's almost cruel or manipulative, but you change the energy right away. Then we use music for transitions. If instead of saying, okay, stop, come and let's sit in plenary, because they ignore you, you just play the right music at a very high volume and they can't keep talking, so they come back. We're using music to send people out to do a team exercise. You create a certain type of energy in plenary, and you need to maintain that energy for the 30 seconds it takes them to get into their breakouts. And without that music, they have to start from scratch when they get to their breakouts in finding that energy. Other tools are like just the words. Now, I find those don't work very well. People don't notice. It's more for my team and I. So, we do work with the European Space Agency, and, we always use Blue Moon, Satellite of Love, Ground Control to Major Tom, whatever. They never notice. It's a waste of effort. They don't care.
Yeah, I usually make fun of myself that changing the music and then with the slider, that's my little DJ moment in facilitation. And I love it.
Yeah.
mostly online though. What remains your biggest facilitation challenge? Or any?
Yeah, I guess it's more context is the challenge. That I think that we have learned to help groups of people who really don't have clear ambitions or are not well aligned. We really help them to find where their common ground might be and to align around some sort of shared desire. And I think the challenge that I haven't, the sorts of challenges that I would like to address that I have never had the opportunity to, would be where those misalignments, those tensions are enormous, which are a lot more in a political realm. Things that cause wars.
Mm.
I think in the context where the lack of common language, the lack of shared vision, the lack of shared intent leads to real suffering and real violence, that's a world that would benefit from what we know how to do. And I've not had the privilege of working very much in that world.
Mm.
And that for me would be my big facilitation challenge, to try to move the sphere of impact beyond business, beyond UNICEF or World Food Program, or we do a lot in the UN world, beyond that and into more the where real conflict lies.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you've read the books by Kahane, who worked on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in
Mm-hmm.
South Africa, for example, and they're fantastic. And boy, do I admire him.
Yeah.
So those would be the challenges I'd like to address.
Requires a different sort of facilitation and even more rigorous mindset in terms of neutrality.
Yes. Yeah, you have to be nobody.
Yeah. And a force at the same time.
Yeah, I say you have to be nobody, but maybe that's not true. I don't know. I've not found myself in that environment. Maybe actually your physical presence needs to be mammoth,
Mm-hmm.
because holding that space is going to be a lot more demanding when the people in that space want each other dead.
Yeah. And moving away from the judgment of right and wrong, and having this loving heart.
Yeah.
I mean, I try to remind myself every time, or I do remind, falling in love with the group. That's so important so that we can give this care and hold the space. But then if our values
care is the right word. And care is one of our, I think as a profession, one of our invisible but ever-present tools, and maybe the most important one. That if I find myself sometimes in very technical discussions and I think, do I care? And it turns out I do. And if I didn't, I probably couldn't do the work. But that you hear the headline and it sounds so boring, payment systems, but then as you unpack it, you realize, there's people behind that with their careers, with their experience, with their ambition. And it turns out you care. And if you couldn't do that, you probably have to walk away.
Yeah. Maybe that's the magic behind facilitation, to get to the point where we see how each participant cares. Because it's so easy to put the disruptive ones or the annoying ones in a box, but then coming from a point where we want to see the world through their eyes and what they care about, that drives this behavior and this opinion.
Now, I find that the disruptive types, for me, fall into two categories. And one category I do want to put in a box, and the other I want to embrace.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to be aware of who is who. And I'm wrong sometimes, but I want to be aware of who's who. And I call them terrorists or snipers. And snipers usually disagree with maybe the premise of the event. They have it in for one of the sponsors, and I am their proxy. So they'll have it in for me. and they want to take me out, and they'll attack me. And it happens maybe 2 or 3 times a year. It's very unpleasant. Yet my reaction or my response is to embrace them. I have to bring them into the fold, because it tends to be that people who play that sniper role do so because they don't feel listened to. And first of all, I'm in no position to judge right or wrong. It's not my job. And even if it were my job, I wouldn't know how to do it. But it is my job to make them feel listened to. So I will pull that person into the dialogue, even though they may, and often do, attack me. And it can be very unpleasant. But again, it's not really about me. They're attacking me because it's easier than attacking the person they really want to attack.
Yeah.
I'm just the proxy. In any event, so that's the sniper. But then there's the terrorist who wants to blow up the whole thing and is actively working against the group, working against the group's ambition, working against that shared intent. And they are very infrequent, luckily. I rarely come across these terrorists who really want to blow the whole thing up. But when I do, yes, I need to isolate them. Maybe give them a task that they can do on their own. But somehow, if they're going to blow, just keep them far away from everybody.
Interesting. And I don't know whether it's because of the word sniper versus terrorist. I suddenly had this distinction in mind, and also from your explanation, that the sniper seems to be driven by a different agenda. So it's the precision. It's, okay, I do have a goal, and this is disrupting the thing, or following a different agenda. Whereas the terrorist is driven by passion, and hence less controllable.
Well, I would say, yeah, that's probably right. Sometimes driven by passion, certainly less controllable. And again, I don't really believe in control. But at heart, at least within the context of that event, destructive. The behavior of the sniper may appear to be destructive, but we need to give them the opportunity for it to be constructive, which means listening to them and ensuring that they feel listened to.
And there might be a blind spot or perspective that everyone could actually contribute from. Whereas if you're blinded by passion and just want to blow up the entire thing, there's maybe nothing to learn for the group.
Exactly. And so the cost of isolating them is very low, and the benefits might be real.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. Keep that in mind. Final question. What is one thing that you would have liked to known before when you got started?
Right. I guess I needed, when I got started, greater belief in the value of what we do. The value taken from a human perspective, but even from an economic perspective. If you don't understand even the economic value of what you do, it's very hard to sell. For example, if you don't understand the human value of what you do, then you limit your ambitions and you dumb it down, and you go small. Whereas, given the magic we can do, we ought to go big all the time, almost all the time. But it means having a lot of trust in the intrinsic power of what we do, not in ourselves, but in the thing that we create together. To do that might actually mean downplaying your appreciation of your own individual power and impact. But what you discover is the power and the impact of the collective, of the group, maybe your own group. Again, everything speaks. Our group, our team is a microcosm of the system that we find ourselves in. I always use the first person when speaking about the client. I always say we. And some people find that an affectation, but it just comes naturally. I always feel like I'm part of their issues. I'm part of their team. For those couple of days. I always say we, meaning them. And that's something that I wish I'd understood better when I started, is that we really are all in it together. It's different from being a consultant where the us and them is an important distinction. Whereas we're really all in it together. Myself and my team and the client, my team, the client, and this world and the system in which they find themselves. We're all in it together. And it's intellectually, it all makes sense, but you have to truly deeply believe it in order to design effectively, in order to sell the work, in order to capture the value at the end.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's sort of a fly-by-night operation. You just, you fly in, you wave your arms about for a couple of days, you fly back out again, send an invoice. If that doesn't stay motivating for 20 years or 30 years,
Yeah.
I wish I'd understood that better at the beginning. It wouldn't have changed much. It would have, I guess, gotten me in a comfort zone quicker had I understood that sooner.
Would you have learned as much in your comfort
Well,
zone?
that's true. You learn from the painful bits. You learn much
Yeah.
more from the painful parts.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing the we. I find it fascinating because it's one of those details, I guess, and the words that create worlds, because with the we, then you have ownership, maybe more care. You're part of the problem space. I think it was Arne on the podcast. He said when he switched from being creative director to facilitator, he realized that he didn't want to be in the solution space, but in the problem space.
Mm.
And as a
That's
facilitator,
that's a great way to put it. Mm.
yeah. And with the we, you do that.
I think maybe that's where that word comes from. Yeah, is sharing. Excuse me. I think maybe that's where that we comes from sharing that ambition and that intent with the client, that distinction between us and them starts to fade away.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Dan.
Great. Thanks, Miriam. I enjoyed that.
Yeah. Time just passed so quickly.
Yeah. Good.
And yeah, thank you. I will put the links to your website and how to find you, how to contact you, how to work with you in the show notes.
Great. Thank you.
And keep on doing the great work.
Okay. Thank you. I hope you get a vacation this summer.
Yes, next week.
Good. Okay. Where are you off to?
Greece.
Oh, okay. Good.
This will definitely be hot.
Yes, it's hot here in Italy and it's hotter there.
Yeah, and in Amsterdam, the summer only started 2 days ago. So
Oh,
we
wow.
really wanted guaranteed
Good.
sun.
Well, enjoy your holiday then.
Thank
Keep
you.
cool. Okay.
I did.
Look forward to hearing how you slice it up. And I, of course, and I'm listening to the other ones that you post.